This is TWiT.
The world is changing rapidly. So rapidly, in fact, that it's hard to keep up. That's why Micah Sargent and I, Jason Howell, talk with the people making and breaking the tech news on Tech News Weekly every Thursday. They know these stories better than anyone, so why not get them to talk about it in their own words? Subscribe to Tech News Weekly, and you won't miss a beat every Thursday at twit.tv.
Protests, significant protests, due to a number of causes, COVID lockdowns, the zero COVID policy. I don't know, I imagine the Xi regime has the will and the ability to crush the dissent, I'm sad to say. It seems like it's a kind of childish to say this, but it's also going to affect iPhones. Among other things, 30% production loss because of mass quitting at Foxconn. Foxconn, this is just part of the overall unrest. I'm very curious to see how this is going to impact China. But among other things, at least in the tech sphere, Foxconn was losing workers. They promised a $1,400 bonus for workers coming to Foxconn and then neglected to pay it. Due to the failure to pay and growing fears about COVID-19, it is said that more than 20,000 new hires have left. And according to 9 to 5 Mac, an internal estimate reportedly says that more than 30% of production for iPhone 14 could be lost. It's already behind due to COVID. All of this is happening at iPhone City in Zhengzhou, China, the big Foxconn plant. Just one of many ways unrest in China is going to be disruptive globally.
It's interesting, the quiet quitting that you hear about in the States, and I know there's controversy over that term, but it really had its roots in the lie flat movement in China. And lie flat is basically what it sounds like. You stop working, you just lie flat on the floor. And that really came from, this kind of crazy culture of overwork in China's tech sector where, people were expected to work like 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Elon Musk would have loved it. But tech workers revolted against those conditions. And I think you're seeing that kind of now move down to factory workers who have historically not been kind of apt to, engage in these kind of mass protests.
This is a big story, just as a global news story. Here last night, Sunday night in Beijing, demonstrators holding up blank white pieces of paper. This is from the BBC. The pieces of paper are symbolic of censorship. People are saying President Xi should step down. This is since Tiananmen Square, this has not happened in China. This is somewhat shocking. So it's of course, look at this. It's kind of amazing to think of it in a country where you really assume rigid control of the populace, that people would take their chances. But you see this in Iran too. You see people, there's a point at which people say enough. So we'll watch that. It's more than just iPhone 14 production, but still, that's one impact that we're going to feel in the U.S. I guess probably in manufacture in many ways.
I studied China in college, and throughout history, the Chinese government is always thought of as having the mandate of heaven, a legitimacy that's kind of handed down. And even the modern, Chinese Communist Party in some ways is legitimate because it's legitimate. That tautological mandate of heaven, I think applies even in the modern day. And so that's why it is so interesting to watch. And it's possible that this could really spiral, because once you lose it, it's gone, and so much of the Chinese regime really relies on kind of compliance. And you can lose it quickly.
I'm rooting for them, for the people. Yep.
And as much as these stories are kind of taking the news now and last month a little bit with this relationship with Apple and how is it going to hurt, international business, the lockdowns have been really strict and severe, particularly in a few of the major cities, going back to like July and August, where I follow a lot of news out of China, and there were reporters who were just giving their day-to-day accounts of being locked in an apartment building in Beijing week after week after week, and having to kind of like trade with your neighbors to get the right foods that you need because you couldn't get access to food. So if you think about like the stress people have been under for the last 4 months of going through this, in a strict and severe way, not just the standard everyday protocols with COVID lockdown, but the more strict COVID lockdown measures that have been going on as cases have been rising. People are at a real breaking point.
Does Apple get any heat for shutting off airdrop right before these protests broke out? We don't know if the Chinese government had told Apple to do this, but they did it kind of unilaterally. They seem to cover it up by saying, well, we're going to do this globally as well eventually. It sure feels like this was Apple once again acting at the behest of the Chinese government. That's got to hurt their reputation if people start to think that, right? What do you think, Nicholas?
Oh, this is so outside of my wheelhouse.
That's why I'm asking you. I want to push you, man.
I wonder how many like average consumers really think about what Apple's policies in China are, like at least consumers in the United States. I would wager they probably out of sight, out of mind type of thing. So I don't know. All of us as journalists and aware of this, it doesn't look right. But also, I didn't like when the tech companies kind of bent to the will of the NSA during all that stuff, during the Snowden stuff either. And I still use those products, so I don't really know.
Maybe I'm being a troublemaker, but I really think that the public should know about this and that Apple should be held responsible for this. They tout, that they are, this privacy-loving, freedom-loving company, and Tim Cook, says that, but they have very close relationships with China. So November 9th, Apple released an updated version of iOS 16.1.1. You might have seen it globally. All they said was this update includes bug fixes and security updates as recommended for all users. But, and this is from Quartz, hidden in the update was a change that only applies to Apple iPhones sold in mainland China. AirDrop can only be set to receive messages globally from everyone for 10 minutes and then turns itself off. There's no longer a way to keep the everyone setting on permanently in the Chinese phones. And you're right, Nicholas, probably nobody understands that that's a big deal in China until you know that AirDrop has been used as a communication tool in Hong Kong for protesters. It's been used to communicate with other protesters, to reach passersby, to spread messages to tourists from mainland China visiting Hong Kong. We had stories some months ago when mainland Chinese people arrived in Hong Kong. They would just miraculously get on their phone a pamphlet explaining what's going on, the news that these people in mainland China never heard because it was censored. On the mainland, according to Quartz, protesters have also airdropped protest literature, particularly on college campuses, which is, by the way, where some of these protests are breaking out now. China's control of the internet is so strong that dissidents have to use any tool they can to get around the Great Firewall. Now, Apple, when asked about this, according to Bloomberg, didn't respond to questions. They said, we're going to make this feature global next year. But, they did it without announcement in China just 3 weeks ago.
I seem to remember AirDrop also being like a vector for abuse. If you just accept everything from everyone, you could be on the subway and people are just sending you photos you don't necessarily want to see. So I always turn that off personally. I always recommend it to friends, like, you should just turn that off. I don't really see the point in having everyone having the ability to just send you stuff. Obviously, the context in China is different, but yeah.
Yeah, no, in fact, I agree with you. I would recommend turn it off. You don't want everyone, but if you're a protester in China,
sure,
there's a value to it. So Apple gets a little cover because they can say, well, this is the right way. This is the way we should do it anyway. Everybody's going to do this globally soon. So they get a little cover that way.
Just to make it explicit, I feel like what the Quartz article is kind of suggesting, and Leo, what you're sort of suggesting is, did the Chinese government ask Apple to make this fix explicitly, right, and did Apple comply and do it
and we
quietly without explaining in its notes, right? And we don't know. But that is certainly a conclusion that one might speculate.
And Apple has cooperated with the Chinese government in other ways, with VPNs.
Yeah.
They've dropped apps. And remember that you can't display the Taiwan flag on iPhones. The emoji for the Taiwanese flag is not available to iPhones made in China, which Apple obviously did.
It's all kind of pointing at the fact that the relationship of a major world power and a government that is pretty oppressive has a strong relationship with the world's richest company, and perhaps the most important company, at least in the Western world. And that relationship is a little bit worrisome. Like the phrase "too big to fail" kind of comes back to mind, right? If either one of these parties, reneges on this contract that they essentially have with one another for Apple to get its inexpensive labor to make parts for its products, right? And keep feeding the purchaser, the people purchasing these products, to keep growing the company. Like, that relationship is kind of worrisome. Like, it's so big and so important to both parties and really internationally that you almost need to make sure that it doesn't fall apart. And that if it is dismantled very slowly and with care. And I want to say, about a month ago, there was a lot of pressure on Apple to find new partners to start making some of its phone products or pieces of the phone product from other countries, so that it wouldn't be relying explicitly on China, because there were already so many factory shutdowns.
Apple makes iPhones in India. They've already started that. Brazil, I think. They want to make them in Vietnam. But that's for a number of reasons. It's partly because they want to diversify, but also Brazil and India both have very high tariffs against products not made in country. So it's also just an economy. You can't sell an iPhone in Brazil or India at a reasonable price unless you make it there.
But you've got to start to wonder, too, what does China think of the business starting to trickle out elsewhere, right?
Good point, yeah. This is a year ago. The New York Times did an investigative report, Censorship, Surveillance, and Profits, a hard bargain for Apple in China. Apple built the world's most valuable business on top of China. Now it has to answer to the Chinese government. And we're seeing that. We're seeing it. We saw it a year ago, and then we're seeing it again. Tim Cook went to China. He met with Xi and others. He probably made commitments in order, and that's the business of Apple. They got to make these iPhones. They make them in China. It's the cheapest, best place they can make it. They've actually, built up the Chinese industrial economy considerably by building so many iPhones there. So, Nicholas, you're right. I think most people aren't aware of it. I want to bring it up because does Apple have a responsibility? And what is its responsibility? I mean, they have a responsibility to their shareholders to make the most money possible. If you want to, the Chinese business is huge for them and growing. If you want to do that business, make that money in China, you're going to have to follow the laws of China.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds almost too literal. But like, if you want to do business with China, you kind of I don't really fault companies for, following the law of their local, whatever country. So I don't know. I struggle with this because it's like, if China wants to be, if Apple wants to be in China, China has rules. If Apple doesn't want to be in China, they're free to leave. But it certainly feels like they're not
there's no
going
middle ground,
to.
is there? Yeah.
So I don't, what do I want Tim Cook to do? I don't know. I'm just a guy in the Hudson Valley. What do I know? It's like, but it's like
I'm just in a cubicle in Yonkers here, folks.
I'm just typing. But no, I hear it, and it's interesting. It's like we want companies to do better. We would like companies to stand up for like human rights.
Yeah, Google walked away from China. But Google didn't depend on China in the way Apple does, right? A Times analysis, this is from that article, May of last year. A Times analysis found that tens of thousands of apps have disappeared from Apple's Chinese App Store over the past several years, more than previously known, including foreign news outlets. Quartz, by the way, was one of them. Gay dating services, encrypted messaging apps. It also blocked tools for organizing pro-democracy protests and skirting internet restrictions, as well as apps about the Dalai Lama. So, I don't know. Owen, what do you think? What is Apple's responsibility here?
Well, I think, Apple obviously wants to operate in China, and it's really hard for the iPhone business model to work unless you have that tight link of the App Store, the apps, and the hardware. And, to do that, they have to go along with local governments. I mean, we do expect tech companies to obey local laws. That is a reality.
And complicating this is the fact that the U.S. government is now starting to cut off China to some degree. Apple's going contrary to U.S. policy in some respects. So is this a balancing act that they're trying to keep two superpowers happy so they can continue to sell products in both?
I mean, it would be fascinating to see, an American administration, any American administration, go as far as saying, like, "Hey, Apple, you can't make iPhones in China, or sell them."
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem like the kind of brewing Cold War has gotten to that point. The Biden administration has taken a really surgical approach to this, and I credit my soon-to-be ex-colleague Max Cherney at Protocol for doing really in-depth reporting on this. They've been going after very specific chip manufacturing technology, especially technology that helps China build like the most sophisticated chips for artificial intelligence
and decryption of our encryption, which is one of the fears of the U.S. government, is they're going to be able to decrypt our communications.
And, but the thing is, again, I would stress the word surgical. Like, they've been doing things that are kind of like aimed at cutting China off at the knees, but without initiating some kind of like global trade war or really doing anything that consumers in the U.S. or China would even notice.
Yeah. There is an issue specifically with a company called YMTC, which is a small Chinese chip maker. The Chinese government funded, and Apple uses, but not in its American iPhones, only in its Chinese iPhones. There is a pressure on Gino Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, to add YMTC to the entity list, that surgical list of Chinese chip manufacturers that are not allowed to buy American technology or components. But Apple is saying, you better don't do it. Apple's saying, don't worry, we only use YMTC chips in iPhones sold in China. But if it's put on the entities list, then Apple would have a problem. They actually couldn't use those chips anymore. So somehow they lobbied. I don't know. The Commerce Department put export restrictions on YMTC, but they did not put them on the entity list. This is the balancing act. And actually, I have a lot of respect for Tim Cook, because he's doing diplomacy, like real hardcore diplomacy, balancing the U.S. government's interests, Chinese interests, and still trying to sell iPhones to both. Marco Rubio said, if Tim Cook understands the risks that YMTC and the rest of the Chinese Communist Party's chip-making efforts pose to U.S. national security and that of our allies, then he and his company should clearly commit to not proceed. But they haven't yet. It's an interesting situation. This is increasingly the problem with big tech, isn't it? That they're global and they have to operate in a global environment.